Welcome to this Tuesday edition of FreightWaves Now. I'm Emily Zink. Chief Meteorologist Nick Austin gets us started. He's talking about severe weather in parts of the U.S.
Welcome to FreightWaves Weather Tuesday edition. I'm FreightWaves meteorologist Nick Austin. Lots of messy, wet, and stormy weather again for several parts of the country, at least across several states. But really, for the first part of the day, there isn't as much going on. A lot of it's going to pick up this afternoon and even during the overnight hours. So for the night drivers tonight, you'll have to watch out as well. So the first thing we're going to talk about is parts of the Great Plains, the Midwest, where we're going to see more severe storms. This will affect portions of South Dakota into Nebraska, kind of right where these two states meet. So I-80, I-90, portions of those interstates, especially coming back later this evening and for the overnight hours is when we'll see the severe storms beginning to once again fire up as a cold front moves through the area. So along I-80, I-90, this will affect Sioux Falls, it'll affect Scottsbluff, areas like that, up towards Pierre, South Dakota as well, and over into southern Minnesota and parts of even northern Iowa over towards Interstate 29. So we're talking about, again, really heavy rainfall with possible flash flooding. Maybe some interstate ramps could end up being closed for a brief time. We're also talking about large hail in many spots and also some very gusty winds off and on. Again, that will pick up again later this evening and into the overnight hours. So overnight drivers, just be aware of that. Heading into the Pacific Northwest, where scattered thunderstorms will be developing during the day today, and a lot of them will be slow-moving thunderstorms, especially across portions of Washington State, including parts of the Cascades, US 2, that route, which is just north of I-90. So right here in this area of red, and also in northeastern Montana, there'll be some slow-moving areas of heavy rain again. So that's where we can expect some flooding or flash flooding across parts of the northwestern United States. But those two areas in particular that are shaded in the red here across Washington and northeastern Montana, those are the areas that are going to be most prone to see flooding and possible roadblocks. The last thing we're going to talk about is Tropical Storm Gabrielle. We have another storm that's out in the Atlantic right now. Winds are only about 50 miles an hour. It's weaker than it was this time yesterday, and it will continue to weaken as it moves further off away from the United States and Canada into the North Atlantic. But it will approach the United Kingdom later this week. By that time, it'll likely be even weaker with winds of maybe only about 25, 30 miles an hour, some higher gusts. But by then, it might not even be a tropical storm anymore. But through the rest of the week, just keep in mind that there could be some very minor or short-term delays with the shipping routes, with some containerized cargo going through this part of the Atlantic between the two continents. Keep that in mind. Nothing major though, but we'll keep an eye on the storm. It should weaken over the next few days. That's what you need to know about your weather for today. So have a great Tuesday and be careful out there.
Welcome to the Carrier Update presented by AT&T Business. Today I wanted to talk about the Northeast market. Generally a backhaul market. It's a market where carriers try and avoid. What I've got up today is a couple of heat maps for you to look at. On the far side here is the heat map. That's the outbound tender market share index. Most of these smaller markets up here in Augusta, Maine, up closer down to Boston, Springfield, Albany, New York, they're in the sort of less than 0.5% range. They're fairly small markets. But one of the reasons that carriers try to avoid this market is because there's less freight coming out of these markets than going in typically. It makes it a low head haul value. It's not until you get back down here around Elizabeth and Allentown and PEA that you find some bigger markets. So carriers tend to avoid these particular markets because there's not much coming out unless you want to run all the way up to Caribou, Maine and into New Brunswick, where there's French fries that are frozen that are coming out from the potato harvest. So generally it's an area that carriers try and avoid. When you have a look here at the head haul index, you can see that Boston has gone deep into the head haul territory today. It's red, whereas Elizabeth, New Jersey, that we want to focus on today, is much bluer, which means there's more freight coming out than going in. But what I want you to have a look at here is the market table that we've built, and shows that as you come further south, the head haul index starts to change. So it goes from deep 60s, where Boston is today, which is a deep backhaul market, less coming out than going in. When you get down here to Elizabeth, New Jersey, you can see it's at 83.14. So when you get to 0 on the head haul index, that means it's a balanced market, about the same goes in that comes out. When you start to get into the plus regions around 83, that means there's a lot of freight coming out. And that's what part of the story is today, that there's a big shift on the east coast of the United States. If you look at the port of Elizabeth and New Jersey, some of the terminals around New York City, there's a lot more freight coming out of there right now. Their freight volumes have gone up. If we can have a look at the next chart, what you'll see is that this is the background here, which is the darker colour, is the head haul index for Elizabeth, New Jersey. So it's gone from being a 0 at the start of the year, fairly balanced market, to being a very strong head haul market. And that's got a lot to do with the increase in containers. Now, one of the ways we look at the import business is we look at the number of shipments that are in each container. You can have multiple shipments per container. So this particular index here is the monthly customs invoice shipment ticker that tells us about the volume of shipments coming in from the import side. And you can see this has increased about 45% year to date. So that as the volumes of freight come into the port, it's driving up the outbound tender volume for the market and creating it more of a head haul market. Now, for carriers in the northeast that are looking for head haul loads out of markets like Elizabeth, you've only got to run 2 or 3 hours out of New England to find freight in this particular market. If we go to the next chart, what you'll see is that here, this is the loaded TEUs into New York, New Jersey. It's up significantly since the quiet period here. But what's really important is that the volume of containers coming into the East Coast in New Jersey has now surpassed the volume of containers to the West Coast over here. So the green line is the Los Angeles market, and this darker background here is New Jersey. Why is that? Well, as the trade war has dragged on with China, shippers have had to realign their supply chains to Southeast Asia countries away from China. What that's meant is that for the shipping lines, it's actually easier and quicker to travel west through the Suez Canal to the East Coast than it is to travel east to the west coast of the US and around to the Panama Canal up to the East Coast. So it's quicker and more cost efficient. What it means is for carriers, more freight is landing on the East Coast than ever before as a result of the trade war. It's forcing more volume into the market. So if I was a carrier, what I'd be looking for is more freight volumes coming out of this particular market. The most important statistics out of this whole analysis is that about 80% of all imports that come into Elizabeth, New Jersey move within a few miles to just 4 counties. So about 80% of the imports into New Jersey goes to warehouses and distribution centres in just 4 counties around Newark. Why that's important? You've got about 90 million people, or a third of the US population, within a 500-mile drive of that particular market. So carriers need to be aware of the shift as a result of the trade war that's going on and how freight patterns are moving from the West Coast to the East Coast, because what it's doing is it's changing the backhaul nature of the Northeast market and dragging it to being more of a head haul market. So it should be a market that carriers should be looking at. If I was a carrier, I'd be watching the import volumes closely, because that would be my signal towards growing truck volumes.
Dean Croak just touched on this a bit in our carrier update, but it's time for our shipper update now. Henry Byers joins me. We're talking tariffs, rates, volumes, all having to do with China. And this kind of piggybacks off what Dean was saying. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, so what I have here is really August volumes. So I've broken this out in a couple of ways. On the left, we're going to have it broken out by country of origin. So where are the US imports coming from? And then secondly, I have this broken out by port specifically. So what I want to point out here is we're looking at places like China, Hong Kong, obviously with the protests going on, Taiwan. Those places are losing volume. And these importers are shifting production because of the concerns with China and how Hong Kong and Taiwan are both affiliated. We're now seeing places like South Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, India, Belgium. These are the places that are the winners in this trade war. So they're picking up volume as these shippers relocate. Specifically on the port side, as Dean was mentioning, we're seeing a significant increase in East Coast volumes. And that's directly as a result of these guys moving into places like India, Singapore, Belgium. It's now becoming more efficient to move on the Suez Canal. And I really wanted to show how this all plays into places like Savannah and how it affects rates. in the market.
You have a good chart here to show that. And what are you comparing in this? Explain what the blue and the green lines are.
Exactly. So this is the only daily index. That's important to understand. So from a BCO, a shipper's perspective, BCO meaning beneficial cargo owner who actually owns the cargo in the container, the FreightWaves Baltic Daily Index is a great measurement of spot rates for 40-foot container, or otherwise known as a FEU, in the Trans-Pacific eastbound trade lane. So we have China, North America, East Coast, China, North America, West Coast. East Coast is in the blue, and it's important to note this is down 22% year over year. So the rates are actually down. So we had a lot of that pull forward last year. Rates were up. So in the green line we have to the West Coast, this is down 32%. These are still higher than contract rates. So if you're a significant volume importer, you've signed contracts that are cheaper than these rates. So you're still trying to force those ocean carriers to give you those rates and honor those rates. But carriers are trying to get very aggressive. Now, ocean carriers are posting better than average numbers right now in terms of profit, net revenue, things like that. So we may not expect them to be as aggressive as if they were actually losing money in those months. But I still would expect them to try to push rates up another $300 to $400 by the end of peak season, which is supposed to be October 15th.
Yeah.
We do have an early Chinese New Year. It's really one of the earliest that's been in like the last 5-6 years. So I would expect them to try to keep rates elevated prior to Chinese New Year as importers continue to try to get volume into the United States.
And they shut down for a week, right, during Chinese New Year?
Well, Chinese New Year, yeah, very similar to what's coming up. I'm glad you brought that up. Golden Week is October 1st.
Okay.
And Golden Week, they actually take as a national holiday. They take about a week off. Logistics companies normally operate, but the ports will largely shut down. And you can actually see that represented here. If you look at the West Coast rates, that big dip there was Golden Week last year. So carriers are cutting services. They're getting better at managing capacity. They're actually doing things called blank sailings, skip sailings, where they actually skip a port in their rotation, or they just do away with the service altogether for that week. And that actually cuts capacity in a way. Whenever you cut capacity and demand stays the same, rates tend to elevate. So I'd expect a GRI on both the 15th and on October 1st.
And we are in peak season right now, and you said people didn't expect as much of a pull forward as we have seen. If you're a shipper, what should you do? You were talking about there not being as much room left on these vessels. Talk about that.
Sure. Well, so a lot of people didn't really think there was going to be a pull forward. There's a lot of uncertainty in the trade war. There's announcements seeming like every day there's a new tweet, especially a few weeks back with all the tit for tat between the US and China. There was a pull forward. Steve Ferriera with Ocean Audit, he's big into the ocean trade, works with a lot of beneficial cargo owners himself. He said that Walmart pulled more volume into Savannah than they had ever pulled in there before.
Wow.
So we're seeing that reflected with those East Coast rates not having quite the percentage decline year over year. Like I said, it's 22% versus 32% for West Coast. And again, the repositioning of those manufacturers, the production, the sourcing, all moving outside of China has now impacted the West Coast where they're seeing less volumes.
Yeah, we'll continue to watch this as we continue to go through peak season. Again, Henry Byers with our shipper update. You're watching on YouTube, so make sure if you haven't already, hit subscribe. Make sure you also like us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We hope everyone has a great day.